So how many of you have heard Jane lecture? A few of you. Okay, well, I am always, of course, very worried about lecturing for people that have heard Jane lecture, because she is not only very good, but she also has a way of engaging you folks. So one of the first times I heard her lecture, we were doing something at Dartmouth, and she does art history, and so there was a painting on the screen, and she wanted the audience to talk about the painting, and nobody said anything. And so she sort of said, well, what do you see? Silence. Are there people in the painting? Silence. So finally she said, what color do you see? And this painting was almost all red. And somebody piped up and said, blue. And Jane said, exactly right. And at that point I knew I was with somebody who was very good at engaging people. So I'm not as good as she is, but I hope to engage with you. And I'm not going to give you a formal lecture, but we're going to talk about what it might mean to read the skies, is what I want us to think about. And of course, the reason why I am interested in this is the event that the United States celebrated this summer on the 21st of August, namely the total eclipse of the sun. So I have to begin with, did anybody see the total eclipse? Did anybody go down and actually go to totality? So let's hear, where did you go?
I went to Greenville, South Carolina.
South Carolina, okay, so you were way toward the end. Where'd you go?
Oh, just up the snowmaking pond of Stratton.
So you saw a partial eclipse then. Anybody else go totality? So one person saw totality. So what was it like? I have some pictures here of people, when they have the glasses on, this is while you're waiting for totality to happen, right? So that you've got a bite out of the sun, but it's still mostly bright, and that's very dangerous to look at that with the naked eye, right? But now here, it's just gone total, and the glasses come off, and people are experiencing something they've never experienced before. Was this your first eclipse?
It was.
So what did it seem like when it first went dark?
Oh, it was indescribable. So the lead up to it, we were actually at right outside a zoo in Greenville, and
Can people hear when he talks? I'm mic'd up, so make sure you...
the monkeys started screaming at each other. All of the flying insects started hovering in place, and it looked like there was a strobe light on them. All of the shadows, it looked like, I mean, the way I've heard it described, this isn't my analogy, but it almost seems like the contrast knob on a television gets turned way up.
Yep.
The planets start coming out just a couple minutes before, so Jupiter is in the sky and Venus was in the sky. That was all we could see there. And I did make the mistake of looking a little bit too early. So like I saw some purple spots for the first few seconds of the eclipse.
That's right here. These are called Bailey's beads.
Yeah, so I was trying to see that stuff, Bailey's beads and the diamond ring. And just when it actually happened was totality, it was just indescribable. It sort of does look like that, with like the spun kind of silvery thread around the edge.
This gray is called the corona. It's 1 million times fainter than the sun. So you can never see this except when there's a total eclipse. And this is this weird stuff that goes out and sort of dances, and it is a kind of metallic gray. It's a color you've never quite seen before. It's very, very powerful. So anything else you noticed?
Well, I guess maybe the most surprising thing about it is when you see pictures of the eclipse, it almost looks like something has locked into place in front of the sun. And I was really surprised to see sort of the depth that you see with the total solar eclipse. So it almost seems like you can really tell how these two bodies are sort of moving in space, like one kind of staying in front of the other for a moment. So that was a really surprising aspect of seeing totality.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you stick around in 2024, it's going to be the next one, and that is going to go through New England. It's not going to be total here, but in the very tip of New Hampshire, it's going to be total. I think you'd have to go sort of over to New York. To the Adirondacks, it's going to be total. So you'll have a chance to see another one, or to see that one. And by all means, I would encourage you to do it. These are amazing events. I mean, you talked about being on top of a mountain. One of them I saw in China, we were up on a mountain. And when you can see the landscape, you can see the shadow coming. So the moon's shadow is moving 1,000 miles an hour. And here comes this thing. This is a cosmic experience. Here comes this black thing. Very, very fast, and then it's dark when it hits you. And so it's best actually to try to see them on a mountain, then you get this broader sense of what it is like. Well, that was millions of people saw this. It's very rare that you go across such a populated area like this. The next one is going to it's going to come up through here. It's going to also go through, the best place to observe was right here in terms of the longest time. The 2024 one is going to come this way, and then it's going to curve up and sort of go out above across Prince Edward Island. It's where it's going to go for the totality. And it is worth taking the time to go get totality. Because even if there's just a tiny bit of the sun is so bright that if you block 99% of the sun, it's hardly going to be unlike sunlight, right? It has to be completely total for things to go weird on you and to be able to see the corona. You can't see the corona if you see just the partial eclipse. It has to be a total eclipse. So drive, get to the middle where you have the longest time, and the longest time is 3 minutes or 4 minutes. So this is a short experience. These guys experienced this for 3 minutes. Yes?
It wasn't totally black, though.
No, it's not dark as dark night because there's other light around that's reflecting, and the moon reflects light, but it is considerably darker, and it gets colder. Did you get colder?
Yeah, especially because it was such a hot day that day. It was
Yeah.
near 100 and humid, and it's just standing out. You had to take breaks from standing out in the sun, and right around a half an hour and leading a little bit closer up to the eclipse,
It starts to
got
get cool.
quite pleasant out. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very nice. Very strange. Very strange.
It is a very interesting experience. Well, 2021, of course, is not the first time, or 2017 is not the first time that this has happened. And so what I want to have us think about this evening is some other phenomena. We're going to talk about eclipses. We also want to talk about the stars, and we want to talk about comets. And I'm going to go back and look at how people have experienced those phenomena in the heavens. And the sort of two ideas that we're going to use to think about this are, the first one's in my title, reading the sky. Now the verb read is not necessarily a word that we use to talk about the sky, right? You read text, you read a book, you read a poem. So what does it mean to say one reads the skies? That's one of the things we're going to be talking about. So this verb reading. And then the other thing is what anthropologists call correlative thinking. Does anybody know what correlative thinking is? It's a concept, sort of a technical concept out of anthropology. This is how we humans think about nature. Think about the cosmos that we are part of, but is not us. And correlative thinking is to say that we take our experience and we correlate that with the experience in the cosmos. So we look for links between the cosmos, in this sense it's going to be stars, eclipses, and comets, and the experience of our daily lives. It's not that nature is some other out there that's totally different from us. But correlative thinking is where people, in having these experiences, try to order these experiences and try to understand the cosmos in terms of their own understanding of themselves. So there's a correlation between my experience here on Earth and between phenomena that take place in the cosmos, and that's called correlative thinking. We'll get a lot of examples of that as we go through. So celestial phenomena then correlate with human experience. We're going to look at this question about whether correlative thinking changes over time. We're going to sweep through 30,000 years of human history here. So this is a big picture kind of talk. And then this question about what happens when we read. And so at the end, I want us to come back and sort of think about whether that's the wrong verb to use to talk about this experience. Is it indeed reading the heavens that people have done in the past? And when you were having your experience last summer on August 21st, was there a reading component in that? Let's just maybe spend just a second. So when I say read something, I mean talk about reading a room or you read a face, right? We use that word sometimes more than just text. What do we mean when we use that word? What's it mean to read something?
Like interpret it in a way?
Gather information, observe.
Deeper understanding.
Deeper understanding, interpretation, information, analyze.
Explain you something.
Okay. There's a sort of intentionality and a method, right? We don't necessarily read, well, what do I want to say? When you go to the grocery store, are you reading things? Well, maybe not. But when you're reading a novel, you assume that the author has something they want to say to you, right? So this is talking about sort of what we get out of it. Yeah.
Is there any relationship to this, to astrology?
Yeah, reading, astrology is part of reading the sky too. What do we have to do to read? We've been talking about sort of the end game, what happens when we read. But what are the techniques used when you read?
You pick up on certain symbols that like mean something to you.
And how do you pick up on those symbols?
I mean, by your experience or by your past, like seeing it before, basically.
Okay.
Your intuition, how you feel.
And you have to learn how to read, right? Reading is something that you aren't born with. You go to school or you learn it before you go to school, but you have to learn. So there's certain rules about reading, right? You have to know something about grammar. You have to know something about these figures on the page. You know, what do the letters mean? You have to learn your letters, so to speak. You learn that in English, we read from the left to the right, right? In Hebrew, we read from the right to the left. In Arabic, we read. So directionality is important. Anything else with reading? You have to attend to it, right? So it's something you focus on. So it's reading the heavens is different from glancing at the heavens, let's say, or noticing the heavens. Reading is a connection of intentionality between you and what it is that you think you are reading. Well, let's look at some examples and we'll come back and look at this. Well, some of the earliest representations we have of human society trying to read its environment and then to represent what they're reading are the Lascaux Caves. And I won't ask if anybody's been to the Lascaux Caves because they've been, I think, closed since the 60s. You can't get in. But before that time, thousands of people would go in there, and then it made all kinds of problems with moisture and whatever. But these are caves in eastern France, discovered about 100 years ago. And a couple of the big caverns are completely covered with figures, drawing. There's a total, they count over 6,000 figures there. They are mostly animals, various kinds of animals. So here's animals that these people would have experienced. There are human figures. And there's a whole set of abstract signs, sort of like plus signs, or there's a handprint, or there's a rectangle. And the anthropologists haven't figured out what those are. But what's interesting is there is no representation of the sky, and there's no representation of what you might call a landscape. So these animals are sort of standing alone, so to speak, and when there's people in there, they're standing alone. There's no, horizon, there's no mountains, there's no trees, there's not that. So this is a representation that you might seem, it looks rather abstract. They did not probably experience all of these different animals like that. But there's been some abstraction going on here. But clearly, for them to be able to come and put these kind of representations deep down in the cave, they had to have done some reading of their environment. Not just glancing, but some reading. Well, one of the earliest representations we have that now looks like it's a representation of the heavens is the Nibiru Disk. Now, this was discovered only in 1999 and was published for the first time in 2002. So this is fairly recent. Have you heard of the Nibiru Disk? Is this something you don't know about? This is the German Stonehenge, is one way to put it. It was discovered in what used to be East Germany, south of Berlin, in a place called Halle. By some sort of grave robber type people, and they wanted to get rich on it, and indeed the German government paid them a lot of money to preserve this relic. So these guys made out like bandits, but they found it, and that's important. So it's this disc. It's about 32 centimeters across, so it's this big. So it's much smaller than the Lascaux drawings. It is a circle, and it's a circle of bronze. And then there are these gold flecks on it, and a crescent, and a deeper crescent here, and a full circle here, and then a strip of gold over here, and it looks like there was once a strip of gold over here that is now missing. So that is a representation of the cosmos. Do I have to to persuade you of that. It's sort of what we see, right? When you stand and you look out, if you're not in Vermont, but if you're in some place that's flat, and this was a place in Germany that was mostly flat, what you see is a circle. And that circle is a horizon, right? And then you've got, above that circle is what you can see in the sky, in the daytime and in the nighttime. And this is the nighttime sky, and presumably these dots are stars. Now, if you look at how they're arranged, you don't see the Big Dipper, you don't see Orion, you don't see any representations. The positions of the stars haven't changed. This is 1600, minus 1600. So that's what, 3,000 years ago. Positions of the stars haven't changed. So there's no representations there except for this little group. There's 7 stars here. Do we have any star watchers? Do you know what this, what's it? That's the Pleiades, right? That's this group of 7 very faint stars. You can see it now. This time of the year, it's sort of maybe at about this time, it's going to be about this high. And it has to be, you have to be pretty dark and have dark adapted eyes to see it, because these are pretty faint stars, but they're really close together. So this, the understanding is they knew about that, and it was the Pleiades. This looks like the moon. Does this look like the sun or the full moon? Well, you can have your debate on that. These are the interesting strips here. These strips are the Stonehenge strips. These strips, so this is east and this is west, these strips mark where it is that the sun rises and sets over the course of the year. If you know right now, as we're getting close to the winter solstice, right, the sun is getting lower and lower in the sky. In fact, when I was driving here, it was a pain because my visor was not right because the sun was so low and coming right in my eyes. Well, that's the sun's low. When the sun's low, it means it's rising close to the south more here. In June, it rises here, and so it goes much higher in the sky. So this disk was made, and it turns out if you measure these angles, they match the position of the sun at that central point in Germany where this thing was found. So whoever made this were keeping track of how the sun rose and set along the horizon over the course of the year, and they realized there was a maximum at the solstices, the winter solstice and the summer solstice. And then anybody know what this is? That's a boat. And the assumption is that in the daytime, when you don't see the moon, it's in a boat and it's being taken from the west back over to the east on an underground river, and then it can come back and rise again. And so that's how you get the cycle going through, is the boat pulls all the celestial objects from after it sets in the one horizon, brings it back to the other side underneath so it can go again. So this is what you might call a picture of the cosmos. It features stars and the moon, and is not representational, but yet has some sophistication in it here. It was found with 2 bronze daggers that were crossed across it, and we think that that was the way it was buried, so that it clearly had a ritual function, that this was maybe buried with some rich person, or who knows, but these 2 daggers across the top is a sign that this was a prepared burial ground, and that's where they found it. This was a big event when this was discovered in 2002. Okay, well, so there were some stars there, but the beginning of what I want to say about stars, and I'm going to separate the 3 things we're talking about, stars, eclipses, and comets, by how regular they are. Stars, I want to try to persuade you, were from the very beginning, and the Nibiru people realized that too, right? So when they did this, and they put those 7 together, that means they have seen that stars don't move with respect to each other, right? The sun and the moon move through the sky. Those stars always stay in this relationship. Stars are regular. Stars do not, they make regular patterns. The Big Dipper stays the Big Dipper. Orion stays Orion. So that's going to be one phenomenon, is irregularity. Eclipses are irregular, right? We don't get an eclipse every month, even though the sun and the moon pass each other every month. But it turns out that from minus 800, people realized you could predict eclipses. They're not regular in terms of your daily experience of regular, like the sun and the moon and the stars are. But if you are an astronomer or a priest and keep track of what the sky does, you realize you can predict eclipses. So they are semi-regular. And then there's this thing called comets that are random. And we're going to see how people respond to this different things. So, regularity of stars. One of the earliest representations we have, this is slightly later than the Nibiru Disk, is the tomb ceiling in Egypt of Ramses VI. So this is a picture of the ceiling. Imagine that we're in a sort of a wine cellar with a curved roof. And this is the highest peak of the wine cellar. So that would be, this figure right here, this yellow, would be right here in this. And the whole ceiling is this representation of the Egyptian cosmos. Now you see these things presumably are stars, but notice they're all lined up straight rows, so they are also not representational, right? We don't see stars in a row, and presumably the Egyptians didn't see stars in a row either. This is their view of the cosmos. This is Nut, the sky god. And it turns out that what the stars do and the sun is it passes through her body. So she's actually the sky. There's other representations of her where you see her standing like this, and she represents the sky. And so when the sun and the moon and the stars move through the sky, they pass through her body, and then they come out and they go again in a river in the underworld to get back to the east side so they can come up again. So we have the same river phenomenon that we saw in the Nibiru disk here. But what I want to focus on are these figures here. It turns out that these are representations of stars that are called decans. And decans are 1/10 of a zodiacal sign. The zodiacal signs were invented by the Babylonians before this, which divides the sky into these 30-degree chunks. And you divide those into 3, and so you have a total of 36 decans, which are stars, given stars that are situated about 10 degrees apart as you go around the sky. And so those stars are going to be rising in the east. And they're regular, right? So one rises, then you wait 10 degrees, and the next one rises, and the next one rises. And the Egyptians used those to tell time.
Why they represent stars? Why do they represent Egyptian people?
That's simple. Whoops, I'm sorry.
Why wouldn't they be dots?
Pardon me?
Why wouldn't they be dots like stars are?
I don't know. This is a matter of how they represented things, and you know I don't know how they read this to turn this into a decans. I don't know the hieroglyphics, but in any case, this is a chart that tells you when this given star comes up on the east, you know it's 11 o'clock at night. So if you're a soldier and you're doing your watch and you have to watch for 3 hours, you wait for your star to come and then you have to go watch. But of course, the same star doesn't rise all through the year at 11 o'clock. And so when you move into the next month, you then have to go read the decans over here. So this is understanding about how the stars come up at different times. So right now, for example, you can see Orion. Right when the sun goes down, you can see Orion just coming up, and it's a winter constellation, but you never see Orion in the summer. We'll get to that in a little bit. Anyway, so stars were regular. Every day they're the same. Every year they're the same. And the Egyptians recognized that by inventing this time-telling system with the decans. Well, you can also make calendars. So the Babylonians, as I said, invented the constellations called the zodiac. Those are the 12 constellations. And this is one of the earliest tablets that exists. It's called the GMALL set of tables. There's actually 7 big tablets like this. And it's a complete astronomy that was written about -1000. And this tablet is dated to 687 here. So this is 400 years after the astronomy was invented. We have a representation of it. And what it does is that it says that these constellations now rise at different months, and you use the constellations to tell your calendar. So when Orion is rising, that means it's time to harvest, because the winter is going to be coming. So now you're not telling the time like the Egyptians with the hours of the day, but you're telling the months with this kind of thing. In one of the earliest Greek texts we have, by Hesiod, 700, -700, it's a book called Works and Days, and he says, here's the Pleiades. At the rising of Atlas-born Pleiades, begin the harvest, and then you plow when they set. So when Pleiades rises, what that means is when the sun sets, Pleiades rises. So when Pleiades rises, it's time then to start your harvesting. That's, back in September. And then when the Pleiades is setting, then it's time to plow. That's going to be the spring. And he goes on and has other asterisms that are used to tell calendars. So again, it's the regularity. You don't want a calendar based on something that's random, right? You need to plow and harvest presumably at the same time every year, and so you want to use the stars to be able to do that. Well, those earlier representations, readings, were readings without mathematics, even though you might say, well, it has the calendar in it, and you so know there's 365 days in the year. But what the Greeks are going to do, starting about minus 400s, this is after the Babylonians, is bring geometry into the reading. The Babylonians did not read geometry. If you ask the Babylonians, you know, is the heavens spherical? They would look at you like you're weird. No, for them it was just these moving points of light. And as to what they were, whether they were on a sphere, whether they went in circles, that was not their thing. They just did numbers for where they were on given dates. The Greeks are going to bring in the sphere. Plato and Aristotle both systematized earlier understanding of the heavens and said the earth is a sphere and the stars are on a sphere. So that we live in a spherical cosmos.
How did they know it was a sphere before Columbus?
Uh-huh. Now that's interesting. So we're going to spend some time on the Columbus story. It turns out that nobody thought the earth was flat. Any time during this period, when people started saying that Columbus and his sailors were so brave because they thought they were going to drop off the edge, it turns out that was a story invented in the 19th century by people who wanted to make the people before look stupid. And so they said, they thought the earth was flat. No, you can tell from eclipses and the curves of eclipses. There's a whole set, there's about 15 things you can look at to know the earth is spherical. And the Greeks wrote them all down. And people discussed this in both China, and everybody thought the earth was round, is the short answer to that. So here's a poem about the cosmos that has the spherical language, day in and day out. Innumerable mixed and scattered stars process above us. They're fixed forever, the stars are, never bending. An axis pins the earth in the center of all of it. Around it spins heaven on opposing poles. The axle's ends, the one cannot be seen, the other extends over the north. So this is using a kind of mechanical metaphor, almost like wheels or spheres, to be rotating. This is the earliest extant representation in 3 dimensions we have of the cosmos that is known. This is about 150 Common Era, but this is a Roman copy of an earlier Greek statue. So we think the Greek statue probably went back to minus 200 here. So here's Hercules, and Hercules is holding the celestial sphere. So this is the cosmos, and these are the diagrams for the stars for the constellations. So this is a representation of where the constellations were in the Greek heavens. So this is what I've been talking about. This is the Greek picture. So when the Greeks and after the Greeks tried to read the heavens, they had this picture. This was the rules of reading. This was saying you start from the left and you go to the right. This was saying that this is a T and this is an H, is having this in their, in their heads. So here's the sphere that he's holding, and we're sitting here on the Earth. The Earth is a sphere. So this is the sphere with the stars. This is the sphere with the Earth, and this is our horizon. Right? So this is this thing that we can see. So we can see anything that's, if we're standing here on the top of the earth, we can see anything that's up. Anything that is above this, we can see. Anything down here, we can't see. That's underneath us. Right? And this thing rotates. And so as it rotates, whatever's on this sphere then is going to rise above our horizon. So when it rises above our horizon, when it gets above here, we can see it. Then it goes for 12 hours, and then it sets, and we can't see it again. There's 3 important circles on this. There is the circle of the equator. So here's the North and South Pole. This points at the North Star now as this thing spins. And so there's an equator, the middle of between these 2 poles. And then there's the path that the sun goes on. And that's called the ecliptic. And it takes the sun 1 year to go around. So the sun has 2 motions every day, right? It's rising in the east and it's setting in the west. It takes 12 hours about. But then it's also slowly moving backwards through the sky, and it takes 365 days to get back to where it started. And that's why we can't see Orion all the time, because we can't see Orion when the sun's there, right? So that if Orion is right here, we can't see it. That means Orion would be in the daytime, and you can't see it in the daytime. So we have to wait until the sun, if Orion's here, we have to wait till the sun moves 6 months, and when the sun is down here, right, then we can see Orion. So now the sun, Orion's up here in the sky above our horizon, we can see it, and the sun's way down underneath the Earth. They can see it in China, but we can't see the sun. So this is the basic picture. Plato invented this picture, the spherical cosmos, and that's the picture that the West has been living in since Plato's time. So to read the sky in the Western tradition, this is the language that is in your head to know what reading is about. Whoops. So you've got those stars. Those stars are regularized. What the Greeks did, the Babylonians started. The Babylonians had about 16 constellations. The Greeks added more constellations to get to the classic 48 constellations. These were pictures of the stars where you take, and this is correlative thinking, you take an object that's familiar to you on Earth and you use it to put in the sky to organize those dots of light called stars. So that you don't remember the individual star names, and most of the stars the Greeks didn't have names for. It's going to be the Arabs that are going to put names on stars. For the most part, the Greeks just had the constellations. So here's Hercules, the guy we saw before. So each of these dots is a star that makes up Hercules, and we don't know the name of that star. In fact, the Greek description simply says it's the third star in the left leg of Hercules. That's the name of that star. It's just a description of where it is in the constellation. So this is from 800. We have manuscripts sort of going back that far. And there's not a lot of representation of texts that exist during this time. So we have that Farnese globe, and then we have Hercules. Here's a Munich manuscript, 820, that now takes a number of constellations and puts them in a kind of two-dimensional representation of the sphere. So back here we had the three-dimensional representation. Now you're just taking half of that and you're turning it into this, and you get a drawing like this with the constellations. There's no dots on these. It's just the sort of the general ordering of where the constellations are. Here's another example of a text that's over in London, about 840, and it's a very fancy manuscript. It's the Erotus, this same poem about the phenomena. And here is Eridanus, one of the constellations, and you can see that here are the stars, and here's the figure. There's a star right there in his forehead, and they actually use text to describe what the constellation is like right as part of this. So this was high artistic. I mean, Jane teaches these drawings in an art history class. This is very important for learning about manuscript painting in the early Middle Ages, are these constellation figures. The Arabs are going to do the same thing. So here is a very important book on the fixed stars, 960, by somebody named Sufi, who was from present-day Iran. And the same idea, correlative thinking. So we have a figure now who's not in Western dress, but is in Arabic dress with the stars on the constellation. Also Hercules here. So this is representing the same stars. Here's maybe the stars that were on the leg that we have here. The Arabic has many more stars in it. And these are little numbers. So that what the Arabs did, rather than saying the third star that was on the knee, is they'll simply say the first star of Hercules, the second star of Hercules, the third star of Hercules, and put numbers on them, which is an easier way to keep track of them. But the whole point is, this is patterns, right? These patterns don't change. So for hundreds of years, these stars are going to keep exactly this shape, and so this is a representation of their fixed reality. Well, when you get printing, you have the same thing. So here is a Greek text, which is also a famous astronomical text. That's one of the earliest astronomical books to get printed. This is from 1485, and here we have Gemini, the twins, again with these are angels that sort of looks like Christian iconography with the stars on them. Here's Cassiopeia, a woman who's tied up. We'd have to read the text to see what the story is about her, but then there are the stars being represented. So this idea of constellations being represented by figures from everyday life is correlative thinking par excellence, and that's how the stars got organized. We take things that we know from experience, even though who's seen angels, and we put them in the sky. Well, it gets more and more formalized. So this is a famous woodcut of the heavens by Albrecht Dürer. the Nuremberg artist, early 16th century. Very fine woodcut with the various stars. There's been a lot of things written on this and trying to figure out where he got the star positions from. And then you go another century, and you have a famous book by another German named Bayer, Aronometria, that has very elegant engravings. So this is Taurus the Bull, and this is Aldebaran, the very bright star that's in Taurus the Bull. No, this is Aldebaran. It's up here in his horn. And so the brightness of stars is represented by how big these dots are here. And all modern star atlases follow this pattern, but they're organized by the constellations. Okay, so that's our sort of first, let's see how the time is doing here. That's our first example of reading the heavens with that Greek spherical context, correlative thinking. You put animals and people and things into the sky. Second example now is going to be eclipses. And here I'm going to tell the story backwards chronologically. So I'm going to start more recently, and then we're going to go back and look at eclipses. So this is a picture of the most famous scientist who's ever lived. You all know who this is. But does anybody know what happened in 1919 with Einstein? Yeah.
Maybe, is that where they were able to prove the theory of relativity by looking at the eclipse?
Precisely. This is the most famous eclipse where the reading had to do with astrophysics, not things from ordinary experience. And the idea was that how does gravity work? Now, that seems like a fundamental question. From very early, people knew that on the Earth, when you drop something, it falls, right? And it seems to fall all by itself. It doesn't go up, it goes down. So why does it go down? Well, Aristotle had an answer for that. It wants to go to its natural place, and he used correlative thinking. You, as a person, naturally want to go home, right? Home is this place that attracts you. So why does a heavy thing fall? Because it wants to go home, and its home is the center of heaviness, which is the center of the universe, which is the center of the Earth. So when I drop this, it's going to fall because it has a natural desire. Just as I have a natural desire to go home, this has a natural desire. Well, that idea lasted for 2,000 years. And Isaac Newton is going to say, well, there's another thing. We're going to call this thing gravity, which is this force, this abstract force that pushes things, that mass pushes things together. But if you ask Newton, what is this force? What's doing the pushing? He didn't know. Einstein's going to answer that question. He says what actually happens that makes things pull together, mass pull together, is that mass curves space. Now, this seems sort of weird. How do you know if it curves space? Well, how do you measure space being curved? Right? You can't see space. But light sees space. And light goes on a straight path through space. And if space is curved, light is going to curve. So Einstein predicted that if you would look at a star that's right close to the sun, you're going to see that star in a slightly different place because the sun curves the path of the light. Now, wait a minute, you say, we can't look at stars close to the sun because that's daytime. But during an eclipse, as you said, the stars come out. So he did the theory, done by 1915. They were going to try to test it in 1917. Turns out that where you could see totality in 1917, right in the trenches of World War I. So you could not test it in 1917. In 1919, there was an eclipse in Brazil. And so astronomers went down there. And so what you do is you take a picture of where the star is when the sun isn't there. And that's the actual position of the star is there. Then you wait for the eclipse, and now the sun is here. So you took this picture 6 months ago when the sun's on the other part of the sky. So then you can get a picture of the star because the sun's away. But then it's back, and now it looks like the star shifted over a little bit. Now you think light goes in a straight line, so you think that the light just goes and you think the star is there. No, the star didn't move at all. What happened was the star is still there, but as the light comes, it gets bent by the sun. And Einstein predicted how big that angle was. That's a tiny angle. But he predicted it, and they did the measurements in Brazil. Here is the actual plate. So this is the photographic plate that they took the picture of. This was discovered back in 2015. And here are stars, circles around the stars they were measuring. And they found that it matched the predictions exactly. This is what made Einstein famous. This thing here made him a world celebrity and was the beginning of, indeed, very difficult times for him. Because when he became world famous, then the anti-Semitism became really bad. And people started to pick on him, especially in Germany, for being Jewish. So this is a sort of a bittersweet date, 1919. It was wonderful for astrophysics. It was bad for Einstein there. Well, this is using eclipses where you're reading the sky now for doing science. Turns out Dartmouth is in this picture. If you go back 50 years from Einstein, this is one of the more famous pictures of Dartmouth's scientific history. This is a total eclipse of the sun that was visible in Burlington, Iowa in 1869. And Dartmouth had just gotten this big telescope, and our professor of astronomy was somebody named Charles Young. And he wanted to go use this telescope to look at this eclipse. So they built this little shed, and here's Charles Young sitting right here, and he's got the Dartmouth telescope set up, and they're getting ready to see the sun. And this is my favorite. This is the most important woman astronomer of the time, Maria Mitchell. She was at one of the Seven Sisters. I forget which one she was. Here she is with this umbrella and this completely big black dress. This is July in Iowa. She must have been hot. And she has a little telescope set up here, and this is still in our collection. I look after Dartmouth's Historic Scientific Instrument Collection, and we have this telescope still there. Anyway, he was not trying to test general relativity. He was trying to look at the spectrum of the corona. It turns out that in the 1860s, they discovered that when you look at light, that light gives off the light coming from this. If you put it through a prism, you turn that light into a rainbow, that there are these black lines. And these black lines are in the light because of the different chemical elements that are there. So that just by looking at light, you can see what the chemistry is of the stars. This was the beginning of astrophysics, where suddenly you don't look at these things just as points of light, but now you can learn about their chemistry. And so Young wanted to know, what's the chemistry of the sun? People didn't know yet what made the sun burn. Some people thought it was coal. And it was just, it's a big thing of coal, and that's the hottest thing you could think of to burn. Well, Young found in the corona, this is the apparatus, we still have this, and this is how he set it up on his telescope to measure the spectrum. He found a line that had never been seen before in the laboratory, and he thought it was a new chemical element. He thought there's actually a different chemistry in the sun, and he called it the coronium because it was found in the corona. Turns out it wasn't. It was actually iron, but the sun is so hot, the corona is so hot. The surface of the sun is 5,000 degrees. That corona we saw on the first slide is 2 million degrees. It is super hot. And what that does is it makes lines from iron and other things that you don't normally know. Anyway, this was a very important discovery. Our professor, Charles Young, was right at the beginning of astrophysics. If they'd been giving Nobel Prizes back in the 1870s, chances are Charles Young would have gotten one for this discovery. So this is another example of an eclipse being used for science. But let's go back and see how people, for the most part, were reading eclipses. They were not reading them for science. They were reading them for astrology. They were reading them because eclipses were scary, according to astrology. This is the earliest horoscope we have. It's from, 115 BCE. This is a cuneiform tablet from Babylonia. And it simply says, on a given night, a child was born. The moon was in Virgo, the sun was in Cancer. So it says where each of the planets were in their zodiacal sign. That is astrology. We're not going to talk about planets. But astrology was a way of reading that was invented not on things that are fixed. The stars are fixed. You don't do astrology on that. You do astrology on the things that move through the sky, and those are the planets. And where the planets are in the sky, according to the astrological reading, was thought then to send influences down and affect the Earth, and affect this child that was born. So where the planets are is going to affect the personality and the life of that child, is the basic idea of astrology. And in astrology, the movement of the sun and the moon for eclipses is the worst, scariest thing that could happen. So people were worried about eclipses all over. Stonehenge. We'll get to Stonehenge now. Stonehenge is primarily about the sun and the moon. It's not about the stars. This is sort of the big diagram of it. I had some Dartmouth students, and we were there back in 2001. I don't think you can walk this close now. They keep you away again, just like the Lascaux Cave. They don't want you to go chip a piece of the... My students wanted to bring a piece of Stonehenge home, and I had to make sure that they didn't do that, or I would never be able to go back. Anyway, it's too complicated to explain, but you've got all of these holes. It turns out there's 56 holes around this, and 56 is an important number for eclipse prediction. So there's no documents, there's no user's manual for Stonehenge that tells us how it worked, and there's been tremendous debates about this. The site has three different levels on it, so it goes from minus 3,100 to minus 1,600, so it's got a complicated history. But the contemporary sort of view is that this was an eclipse predictor. That you build this huge thing, and it has religious significance. Undoubtedly, there were priests there, and you would come to have ritual experiences. But you could also, using this thing, predict when there were going to be eclipses, because you wanted to know that, or especially the king or the religious leaders wanted to know that, because you wanted to show that you were on top of things, rather than have this eclipse come that you weren't expecting, because that could be super scary. So this is way back early Bronze Age. The Chinese did the same thing. This is in, has anybody seen this? This is in the Forbidden City. It's called the Temple to Heaven. And this is where the astronomers hung out there. And the Chinese astronomy, a massive astronomy supported by the state. The first sort of NASA or National Science Foundation where the state supports science was the Chinese Empire and the Chinese dynasties. Why? Because they were afraid of eclipses. And they wanted to make sure that they knew when there was going to be an eclipse so the king or the dynasty could make the proper announcements and pacify the public. If one went by that they missed, that could be the end of your family. And so these astronomers over-predicted like crazy. They wanted to make sure they didn't miss anything, right? And they were working there. So here it is 100 years ago. They were postcards about this thing. So here's the geometry. We don't need to go through the details of the eclipses. You've got the Earth here and the Sun here, so the Earth is moving and the Moon's going around, and of course you're only going to get an eclipse if things are lined up. And Greeks by minus 700 knew this picture. And this is all based on spheres. So there's no flat Earth picture here at all. Eclipse numbers. We don't have time to go into this. It turns out predicting eclipses is super hard. It's the most difficult thing you have to do. I'm writing some papers right now looking at medieval astronomy. And the best brains in medieval astronomy were not trying to invent telescopes. They were not trying to figure out, the shape of the cosmos. They were trying to solve eclipse prediction, and to do it where the math wasn't so hard. These numbers are terribly difficult. There's a famous quote here. If God had consulted me before embarking on creation, I would have recommended something simpler. This was King Alfonso. He had a big group of astronomers working for him. And yeah, if God would have made, the month to be exactly 1/12 of a year, then life would get easy. But it's not 1/12 of a year. All these numbers are what's called incommensurate. They don't divide into each other. And so this is super complicated to work out the math of this. Eclipses, Hebrew literature, very early. There's eclipses in the Bible everywhere. I just pulled out some of them here for what they mean. And for the most part, they mean scary things in the Bible. So here's the destruction of Israel. I'm going to make the sun go down at noon, darken the earth in broad daylight. Wicked prophets, when wicked prophets come, the sun's going to go down. At the end time, when the day of the Lord is coming, right, and somehow it's going to be the end of the whole cosmos, then the sun and the moon are going to be darkened, and the stars are going to get turned off, even. Or in Job, God's power. What makes an eclipse? Well, God stops the sun, etc. And of course, in the crucifixion, as reported in Matthew, it got dark for 3 hours. Now, of course, eclipses last for 4 minutes. So the timing isn't quite right here, and there's been all kinds of discussion about what that might mean, if it means anything at all. But nonetheless, eclipses are alive and well in this early Hebrew literature, and they also mean scary things. Greek history, you can oftentimes find eclipses to be part of battles or scary things happening. So here is a very important battle for the expansion of Greeks as they moved east. So Alexander the Great is fighting the Persian king Darius III in 331. And there was this lunar eclipse just before the battle was supposed to start. And that especially, and Jupiter was visible, just like you saw Jupiter. And Jupiter was the planet for the king. And so Darius was a king. Alexander was not king yet. Darius was a king. And that meant Jupiter during eclipse, this was going to be bad news for Darius. And of course, if you know the story, the Persians got wiped out by the Greeks. And so this is legendary in this eclipse, in the Greek self-understanding, that this eclipse was an omen. They read the sky, and the sky was that Darius was going to lose, and he lost. So that's a political reading of this eclipse. This mosaic, it's a big mosaic. One of my colleagues wrote a book on this, is now in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. Next time you're in Naples, by all means, go check this out. Well, eclipses, everybody's trying to predict eclipses. I'm studying, these are early calendars from the end of the 15th century, beginning of printing. They represent eclipses. Here's books that let you calculate when eclipses are. Here's one, 1474, Feuerbach, 1514. I said I was going to talk about Columbus. Do you know a story about Columbus and the eclipse? This is probably an apocryphal story, but it was picked up by Washington Irving. The American writer Washington Irving wrote a book on Christopher Columbus. The first edition was in 1828. And he has a chapter about the eclipse and Columbus. This was on Columbus's third voyage, 1504. He's in Jamaica, and things are going bad for him. The Jamaican, the Indians, are not giving him food anymore. He was giving them trinkets for food, and they got tired of the trinkets. And they kept raising the price, good capitalist Indians. Raising the price, you know, you have to pay us more. And they ran out of trinkets. His people got sick, and there was some rebellion. Some of the guys ran off, and so it made Columbus look weak. And what's he going to do? He might, you know, starve if the Indians don't provide him food. Well, he had this book, he had this book by Regiomontanus. And this book gives eclipse predictions. And he predicted that there was going to be a lunar eclipse based on that book. And this is how it's described by Washington Irving. In this extremity, a fortunate idea presented itself, so this is 19th century prose. We're going to want to read this prose. A fortunate idea presented itself to Columbus. From his knowledge of astronomy, he ascertained that within 3 days there'd be a total eclipse of the moon. He therefore sent an Indian who served as his interpreter to get the chiefs to a general conference on the day of the eclipse. When they were all assembled, he told them by his interpreter that he and his followers worshipped a deity who dwelt in the skies, who favored such as did well, but punished all transgressors. They must have noticed this, as he'd protected somebody else on their voyage as they got across. The great deity, he said, was incensed against the Indians because they refused to provide provisions. And so the deity was going to chastise the Indians with famine and pestilence. Lest they should disbelieve this warning, a signal would be given that night. They would behold the moon to change its color and gradually lose its light, a token of the fearful punishment which awaited them. Many of the Indians were alarmed at the prediction. Others treated it with derision, but they all waited for the coming night. When they beheld the dark shadow stealing over the moon, they began to tremble. With the progress of the eclipse, their fears increased. And when they saw a mysterious darkness covering the entire face of nature, there were no bounds to their terror. Seizing whatever provisions they had, they hurried at the ships, and they threw the provisions at Columbus and said, "Please take them and intercede with his God so that they would not be punished." Regarding Columbus with awe and reverence as a man with a peculiar favor of the deity, since he knew upon earth what was passing in the heavens, they hastened to propitiate him with gifts. Supplies arrived daily at the harbor, and from that time forward, there was no want of provisions. Now, did that story happen? We don't know if this happened. We know that there's the Regiomontanus book. We know this book is here, and I checked last night. The prediction is exactly where it would have been at 8 o'clock in the evening, the moon. And that prediction is good within 5 minutes. So this book had the right prediction. We know that Columbus had that book. Did he actually do this scenario that Washington Irving wants us to believe? I don't know. Right? Remember, Washington Irving is a guy who thinks Indians are stupid. And so you have this kind of ethnicity thing going on in Washington Irving. But nonetheless, it got represented, and this is a classic woodcut in this book that shows Columbus pointing at the eclipse. Well, there's a few other eclipses, and then I'll wrap this up pretty soon, in U.S. history. Here's one now where the Indians are going to know. I don't know if you know this eclipse story. So this is Tecumseh and his brother, Tinkswatawa, who were in Ohio, basically in Indiana. In that period is where the Shawnee were. And his brother was called the Prophet. And he predicted a total solar eclipse in 1806 as a way to sort of show William Harrison. This is William Harrison who's going to become elected president. He was the army general out there trying to deal with the Indians. And he was sort of looking down at the Indians. And so Tecumseh said, hey, my brother can predict eclipses. And he did. And it's been a question to this day as to how he did it. Because as far as we know, the Shawnee did not have quantitative astronomy. They were not tracking the sun and the moon with the numbers you need to predict eclipses. So the assumption is probably that the prophet had connections with the English community and got one of the English books that had almanac and gave the information. But nonetheless, here, the Indians used the knowledge of predicting the eclipse to put down the Americans. Rather than the way Columbus used it to put down the Indians, it's sort of a reverse story here. And then another famous eclipse, Nat Turner's slave revolt. This is one of the first slave revolts in Virginia in 1831. And he had sort of an army, Matt Turner did, and they were going to rebel against the planters and massacre the white people, and they did that. And then they were, of course, all completely massacred by the federal troops that came in 1831. But to get solidarity among the slaves, there was a solar eclipse. Turns out it was an annular eclipse, so that the moon does not block the whole sun, so it just cuts out the middle of the sun, which is very rare. And when the slaves saw that, and that Turner told them that's a sign for us to go. So they're reading the heavens, said, this is a sign we're going to win this battle. And so he got his hundreds of troops, and they started the rebellion, and it was marked by an eclipse. Okay, let me just say in conclusion just a bit about comets. The story here is shorter. These are these completely irregular things, right? So this is the comet of 1577, a very important comet for astronomy. And everybody in Europe wrote about this. So here's a broadside. This is sort of for the common people, written in German, over Nuremberg. So here's this huge comet that sort of looks like a star with this big tail on it. And then here's a book in Latin that was written about the comet with some Hebrew on it here that was published in London. And so there were literally hundreds of books published about this event, and many people trying to read what comets meant. Well, they're random, and so that makes them hard to situate. You can't predict when a comet's going to come, at least not until 1687. And you don't know what comets are. There were big debates from the Greeks on as to what a comet was. Aristotle thought that they were something like the weather, like lightning. And what he thought was that, you have volcanoes, or you have sort of gas coming out, some kind of, he called it exhalations, coming out of the earth, and this stuff goes up in the sky, and when it gets up in the sky, it gets warmed, and it starts on fire. And sort of like lightning, you get this thing that's there just for a short time, because fire only burns for a short time. Comets are only there for a short time. So he thought it were physical. Seneca, a Roman poet later, said, no, these are divine events. They are some kind of divine mystery that God is doing. God is giving us a sign. And you shouldn't try to explain it physically, because it's a religious thing. It's a divine thing. And they could be anywhere. Well, they were random. And because they were random, they were especially read as signs. When you see a comet, then the cosmos is trying to tell humans something. Unlike eclipses, which you can predict. The earliest one recorded is again in China. One of their texts talks about a broom star, a star that looked like a broom, and we think that's probably a comet, in 613. So this is early. We don't know. There was no attempt in that record to explain how this might have been read. The most famous comet in antiquity is Caesar's comet in 44 BCE. That was seen for a couple weeks after the assassination of Julius Caesar. And the reading here was political. Comets were seen as being linked to the death of political leaders here. And the person that pushed that is Caesar's son, Augustus. So here's a coin that was made by Augustus. Augustus is going to become the new emperor after Julius Caesar. And so here the comet has sort of got 8 spikes on it with a little bit of fire here. You don't know quite what that looks like as the comet. And he was very keen about this comet. He said, this comet solidified me in my political, somebody killed Julius Caesar, right? So that's not a good way to have political succession. But the comet then gave credibility to Augustus. The cosmos declared that Julius Caesar should die, and I can then move in. Well, that's what the Augustus thought. But if you look at the popular texts on this, comets were bad, just like eclipses were bad. When a comet comes, bad things are going to happen. Your crops are going to fail, your children are going to die, there's going to be sickness, there's going to be war. Well, another example of that, this is another famous comet picture, the Bayeux Tapestry. Have any of you seen the Bayeux Tapestry? Over in Bayeux, in Belgium? That's worth a trip. It's this huge thing that's maybe, I don't know what, 60 meters long. It's in a big building to go around, and it's a history of the area of Northern Europe, and it has the Norman invasion of England. So here is the comet, right here is a picture of the comet. This is the comet of 1066, and 1066, of course, is when William the Conqueror comes in and is going to, the Normans are going to take over England. And one of those kings, a Scandinavian king, his name was Harold, and here he is. So he's getting ready to invade. So here come the astronomers, and they tell him about the comet. And here are his boats, all ready to go across the channel. And he's going to go across the channel, and his army is going to be wiped out. The invaders actually win, but Harold and the Scandinavians lost, and he was killed in this. And so here is this comet that the Bayeux Tapestry says foretells his defeat. Because he's the one who understood it here. Well, just to finish the story, comets could not be predicted until Isaac Newton realized that what a comet is actually a planet that is on a very elliptical orbit. So most of the time it's way too far away to see, but then it comes in and swings close to the sun, and for a short time is visible, but a comet is actually going on an orbit just like a planet goes on an orbit, so that one can predict comets. And Halley's comet, which the famous one that Newton used to figure this out, was that comet of 1066. So they saw that comet in 1066 for 3 weeks, it went away, and then it came back in 1684. And then it came back again in 1910. It comes back, I think it's actually a 75-year cycle, but it wasn't seen there. Newton is going to explain this with universal gravity, the fact that these masses attract each other, so the sun is attracting this mass, but the comet came with such high speed that it goes in this highly elliptical orbit. So you could then predict them afterwards, but that doesn't mean that they still weren't red. So here is one of my favorite drawings. This is what, if you take the 72 of the comets that by 1800 were known, and you draw their orbits. So here's the sun in the middle, and you can't quite see here, but there's the orbits of the planets are going around sort of here. And then here are these orbits from the comets that come in and they go right by the sun, then they go away for hundreds of years, and they come back again. And there's all these different shapes of orbits. Now you look at that and you think that looks like a mess. So this was published in an encyclopedia in 1802, this picture. And this picture was read, does anybody can guess how this picture was read? This picture was read religiously, theologically, to do natural theology. Natural theology, it's been done for a long time, especially in the 19th century, is where you look to nature to look for evidence of an intelligent designer that is there. And so you look at this and you say, oh my God, all these comets, they're going to smash into each other, they're going to smash into the planets, they're going to destroy the solar system. But they don't. Because they were created by God, who is the best cosmic architect there is, and God arranged all this mess so that nothing runs into each other. So you look at this picture as evidence of God's providence and God's intelligence. So this was being read, comets now, not just for triumph of Isaac Newton, who without God was able to give explanations for how the planets move, but was also given as evidence for God as being a benign creator. God made a world that's not going to collapse. God made a world that's going to be stable over time. And even with these irregular comets, nonetheless, they all are arranged so they don't run into each other. I mean, most of them are away all the time, right? So this picture is a funny time-lapse picture where you've got 500 years in this picture. So that if you look at it that way, it's mostly empty space in the solar system most of the time. So you don't have to be so clever to make that. But nonetheless, this picture was to show that God was indeed clever. Whoops. So I thought I'd end with a comet that maybe somebody of you have seen. Did anybody see this comet? That was 20 years ago. It's probably the last famous comet that we experienced because it was so bright in the sky here. It was Hale-Bopp, and you know it was a big deal, but people were still reading it. So I found this afternoon an example of somebody reading this. I don't know who this is. D.R. Turi sent an email in December of '96. So he says that a UFO was sighted next to the comet. This object is now close to the planet, and it's pursuing the comet, and it's got a name. Many people have asked me if the object was a UFO or a celestial body. Some of you asked me if the Hale comet will hit the Earth. Yes, Hale-Bopp comet is on direct course with the Earth. Such awful phenomena means certain death for all living things on the Earth. So it's not just people back in -600 that read the skies as being scary. Here is somebody in 1996 who's reading this comet as being scary. But he says, however, weeks before the disastrous impact of the incredible mass, the incredible mass imparting a gigantic ice and gas formation would, upon entering our orbit, immediately produce a serious shift of our poles, mostly due to the comet's unusual size and the inconceivable gravitational pull. That doesn't make any sense in terms of physics. So this guy doesn't know his physics, but he's writing out to his people that this is a comet that could endanger the Earth. And of course, if a comet did smash into the Earth, that would be bad news for probably the Earth.
Depending on where it is.
Well, there's actually interesting debates about that, but some comets are pretty big. Anyway, the point is that I want to try to convey you is that these regular phenomena in the sky and the irregular phenomena in the sky have prompted readings. And the readings are based on other assumptions. They're based on understandings of the structure of the cosmos. They're based on you have to go from left to right. And that reading continues. And I think the kind of excitement that there was last summer, last August, for that eclipse, with I don't know how many million people saw that in the United States, shows that people are still interested in reading the sky. And I'm sure if I'd looked around on the internet, I could probably find this kind of language for that eclipse last summer, too. Yeah.
So, astrology and astronomy share the same roots. For
Absolutely.
And I know early in the Catholic Church's history, they sort of dissed astrology after it was considered actually of high science.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did the scientific community distance itself from the interpretation of the moon?
Mm-hmm. That is a 17th and 18th century kind of phenomenon. People have traced this. I mean, astrology continued alive and well. And my calendar makers, the people that make the calendars, I mean, if you look at your calendar now, and it has the times of the new and the full moons on this to the minute, anybody know why those are there? You don't care about the exact time of the new and the full moon.
Well, I mean, it is an old habit, and the rhythms of light and dark have influenced humanity forever.
Mm-hmm.
But it also influences the tide, and that's my guess, that there's some sort of physical impact on it.
It's tide, but it's actually a more local tide. It's the tide of you. It's bloodletting. Astrological bloodletting that was alive and well up till 1800 was based on whether the moon was waxing or waning. You needed to know that before you could do bloodletting. And all these early printed calendars that I study have that information on, and they still are on, as a sign of this astrological medicine, this idea still continuing. So popular astrology is still alive and well. But in terms of academic astrology, where you go to a university and you study astrology, that is going to stop around 1750, where there were actually chairs for astrology. They were either in the medical faculty or they were in the mathematics, physics faculties. But the chairs for astrology are going to disappear in the middle of the 18th century. But that's fairly recent. I mean, Dartmouth was started in 1769. And I'm sure, Dartmouth was started by a bunch of Masons. And the Masons have views that are supportive of astrology. So I'm guessing that the founders of Dartmouth probably had certain kinds of astrological inclinations in their worldview. Well, other questions or comments? Yeah.
So relative to reading the skies and relative to astrology, you know, when the zodiac, which is the planets, of course, you know, traveling around, the sun traveling through them, and the different planets traveling through the signs. they have certain indicators for a Leo, a Scorpio, a Virgo,
Yeah.
a Gemini, and many of these things are assigned characteristics. How, over the centuries, over the time, over many centuries, are these characteristics assigned? And furthermore, why are so many of them valid at these times?
They got assigned very early. So it's like, you know, why do we write the T and then we say T for T? These are arbitrary things, right? The way that you could put the sounds with any letters. It was an arbitrary thing when the alphabet got invented. The same here. It goes back to a book by Ptolemy, who was the sort of the biggest Greek astronomer, astrologer. He wrote a book called The Four Books, Tetrabiblos, in 150. And he is the one who said Taurus means this, Gemini means this, gave the basic meanings. And those meanings haven't changed. So Mars has been the planet of war, and Jupiter's been the planet of marriage and royalty, and Venus is the planet of love. Those kind of connections, that has not changed for 2,000 years. So in that sense, astrology is very fixed and very stable in its meaning structure. If anything, more meanings have been added on. So that what you have with astrology is what I call overdetermination. Astrology doesn't give you one interpretation, it gives you 50 interpretations. And what an astrologer does is sort of sorts through all those 50 interpretations and makes a mix, sort of like baking a cake. Makes a mix of these things and gives that as her reading for what the skies are. And they're never wrong, because the different levels, you can always say that, well, I should have not emphasized this, I should have had this. You can never refute an astrologer by appealing to evidence. It's just like you can't do climate change that way either. There's certain sort of conversations that take place in different sort of levels of language, and astrology is probably one of those. But we don't teach it at Dartmouth, astrology, and they didn't teach it at Dartmouth in 1769. Yeah.
When is the next comet?
Nobody knows.
Oh,
Well,
we can't
well, the ones that we have the elements for, we know when they're going to come back. So that Halley's Comet came back, and I think it was a big bust. It came back in the 90s, wasn't it that, when Halley's Comet came back? When was it? 86. So if we add 75 years to that, that's when Halley's Comet's going to come back again. So we can predict those, but the problem is that we, the astronomers, don't have the orbital things exactly, so they don't know exactly how close it's going to be to the sun. And that makes a huge difference for what the tail looks like. So this tail that was so bright, you could see Hale-Bopp in the daytime. I mean, the sun has just gone down here. And that's because it was very close. And some of these comets are new comets. And so it's like their first time. And the first time they go past the sun, they've got a lot of dirt on them. And so the fresher they are, the bigger the tail is, if they're close to the sun. But no, I'm sure that I could find a website that would give me predictions of comets. But I must say that I don't pay any attention to that. So I don't know when the next comet's going to come.
What made them realize that when a comet disappeared, that it would come back and it was the same one?
Well, that's what Newton did. What Newton did was track the motion of the planet in the sky, and he had the mathematics. So you just see a little piece of it, right? So here's the big orbit of Halley's Comet, and he just had a little piece of it. But he was able to use mathematics and use his theory of gravity to predict what the rest of the orbit would look like. And then he could go back, and he knew about that 1066. And he could then see if indeed his numbers would match the 1066. And they did. This is one of the things in his book, The Principia, that blew people out of the water, where until that time nobody dreamed that comets were periodic. They thought that comets were these random events that, just like lightning, happened once, and that was the end of that. And when it came back, so there were still debates about Newton. The French didn't like to follow Newton. But when it came back, so Newton predicted in like 1749 the comet's going back. Newton died in 1727. So, his generation was dead. But when it came back, this was headline news across the world, just like the 1919 eclipse thing with Einstein. That everybody said, Newton's theory of gravity proved correct. Halley's Comet came back only 2 weeks late. So he was off by 2 weeks, but that was good enough for that prediction. And that was sort of the end of Cartesianism. That was the alternative to Newton. for Cartesian physics, fringe physics. That was the end of it after the Halley's Comet came back.
I have one. On the Mayan calendar, because we didn't really touch upon that in
Yeah.
terms of the eclipses. Were they also just as predicted?
Yes, they had predictions. The Mayans were looking for cycles, lengths of cycles, and had numbers for these. And in the Dresden Codex, which is one of the big books that survived, it's just filled with all of these cycles. So their predictions for eclipses were very good. And they also, like that Nibiru Disk, had architectural monuments that were marking the solstices. So there's a famous pyramid I show my students, I didn't put the slide in, that is angled so that on the first day of spring, the 21st of March, the shadow from the sun, when the sun is rising and setting, goes right against the step of the pyramid, and there's a big stone thing that comes down, and it makes a shadow of a serpent. And it's when the serpent is coming from the heaven to the earth, and that's when the gods come to speak to them. And that's because the orientation of the pyramid has been planned based on hundreds of years of observations to match where the sun is. Down in the Yucatan Peninsula is where this is.
And I guess I would say, isn't it true also, and I don't know my subject that I'm going to mention, biogeometry, that's true with certain pyramids also in Egypt, where
Right.
when the sun hits certain angles at certain times, there's theories that it actually created energy. But nonetheless, same thing in that sense, by the way it was not planted, built, planted, who knows, however it got.
Design. Now this is called archaeoastronomy. It's a special part of the history of astronomy where you combine archaeology and history of astronomy, and you look at sites.
Yeah.
So Stonehenge is an example, these other stone circles or orientations of buildings, or sometimes you'll just have two sort of piles of stone that are piled up in the middle of the desert that couldn't have naturally occurred. And so then you start to look for orientations. What do these point to, and could they have an astronomical explanation?
And in the heavens, I guess nobody ever read the pyramids into the heavens, so to speak. There's no stars that are the pyramids?
No. For the most part, the classic 48 constellations are all life forms. They're people, they're gods, they're animals. There's one thing called the triangle that is, no, it's in the southern part of the sky, but it has a picture of a triangle, but I think that's later than the Greeks. I think that was added by the Arabs. Is anybody unhappy with the notion of reading? Is that the wrong verb to use for what these people were doing? Or what we do when we look up? Okay, well, I have to take the word read and put it in interesting ways. I do a seminar with my scientific instrument collection called Reading Artifacts. And my students are used to reading text all the time. That's how they get their education. But how do you read an object is what we try to do. So that I think reading is an important verb to describe how we gain knowledge. And we do it in many different ways. Looking up or looking at this chair. You can read that. So any other questions?
I have one silly question, but do you happen to know if it's called a constellation, or these 3 stars that are in the southern sky right now, if that has a name?
So what time of the day are they in the southern sky?
It's in the middle of the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, I'm not up at 3 in the morning.
I know, when I get up and
How
I
hot?
look out the window at
Oh no,
that
that's cool.
time.
That's cool. Pardon me? That could be Orion's belt, because Orion now at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the night, Orion is just coming up above the mountain where I live. And so by 3, those would be 3 bright stars in a row. That's probably Orion.
Okay.
They go across.
So look, there's a big star for Orion's shoulder. So you've got the 3 stars down here. Look up to the right from those stars and see. If you see a bright star, then it's Orion.
Yeah, there is a bright star there. I just thought it was something that I see all the time.
If you ever see something in the sky and you want to know what it is, I mean, there's this app, my daughter has an app where you just point your phone at the sky and it will tell you what it is. But you can also, if you're old-fashioned like me, you can go to the website of Sky and Telescope, which is the best magazine for amateur astronomers. And it's published every 2 weeks, and they have maps about what you're seeing in the sky. So if you say 3 o'clock at night, you go to their 3 o'clock at night, and it will then show you exactly what the sky is and identify the stars and the planets.
During the daytime, by the way, if you point your camera up,
It'll
tell you what's up.
what the stars. So it can see in the daytime. It's using the GPS. It's cheating. It's not looking at anything.
You know, websites really aren't old, sort of modern.
Well, I don't know. My daughter's 26, and she lives on her phone and apps, and she doesn't go to many websites anymore. But yeah, well, that's where I was this afternoon. It's in the library.
We could be original like Aristotle and those guys.
He didn't read. Aristotle, all their things were all oral. You would go and you would study by talking with him every morning, and it was only much later that people wrote down their words into books.
You know, the 1666 date was interesting because something bad did happen in England.
Right.
The Great Fire of London was 1666.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe there was something to this bad omen thing about comets.
Just coincidence.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that happen in the world, and so again, if you're inclined this way, you can make the readings so that they make sense. Well, what's interesting about the reading is that you mentioned intentionality, and all of this reading is based on the assumption that we want some kind of meaning, right? We live in this chaotic world, and we want some kind of meaning that has a cosmic sort of imprimatur on it, and that's what people see in the sky.
Nope. Sometimes you just got to accept it is what it is.
That is absolutely true, and most people are doing that. But by reading, they're trying to look for more meaning, I think. And those three girls that we saw here looking at the eclipse last August, they had an event, they had an experience that they're going to remember for a while, I think. No, it turns out that I was in Europe, and I had some other travel, and I didn't come back. I made it. I've seen two. One in China and one in Turkey. I should have come back for this one. I mean, I was betting the weather was going to be bad, but I was wrong. So the next one in 24, well, I'm going to maybe try to get to one sooner, because they are really, now that I'm retired, I have a little more time, they are really worth a trip around the world to see one of these things, even though it lasts for 3 minutes. Yeah, this one's going to be really close.
Was there an eclipse in Europe in about 1960 or something?
No, there could have been. I don't know. There could have been.
We have 4 annual eclipses. We have 2. We have a lunar and a solar eclipse, and I think the lunar eclipse is the end of January, and there's one in mid-February, 15 days later, and then we'll have another set in the fall. They happen all the time, but they happen all over the world. You're not
at the right place. I think once every 18 months, there is some kind of a solar eclipse. But most of them are in the ocean, and you it's hard to get to them. And the lunar eclipses, unlike the solar eclipses, the lunar eclipses are visible to everybody. So if you're on that half of the Earth, the entire half of the Earth can see a lunar eclipse. I've been looking at those for a long time. I'm interested in the question about when you see the beginning of first contact, how close can you decide with your eye that it's now? Because that's how you do, when you try to make maps, you can use eclipses to do this. And so for the last 10 years, every time there's a lunar eclipse, I go out and I use myself as the guinea pig to see what the time is, and then I compare it with what the astrophysicists have predicted, and to get the precision of how close the human eye can determine this thing. And it's about 3 minutes. So there's a 3-minute uncertainty as to when the eclipse starts and when it stops, based on me. Yeah, it does. If you're trying to map 3 minutes, the Earth moves in 4 minutes. It moves 1 degree. So if I'm trying to use eclipses to make a map, and if I'm off by 3 minutes, I'm off by 3/4 of a degree, and 3/4 of a degree is a lot. I mean, that's off by 90 miles, 100 miles, in making a map. Or if you're a sailor and you don't want to hit the rocks, you don't want to be off by that much. So yeah, that matters.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you.